The Boston Massacre. England sent troops to Boston, the center of American resistance, and mob action forced the colonists to pay for those troops. The Boston Massacre. And then there had been some settling down from 1768 to 72, but in 1772, England inaugurated a whole new crisis by offering to pay the salaries of judges from England. Again, seemingly an innocuous request. You're uptight about taxes, we'll reduce your tax burden, we'll pay your salaries of your judges. The colonists said that's the next step in a master plan to reduce us to slavery. That's full of sinister British designs. And of course, followed by the Tea Act of 1774, the Boston Tea Party, the Crown's decision to close the port of Boston, the moves by the colonists towards military defense, the outbreak into open fighting and Revolutionary War by 1775. In 12 years, we go from contented subjects to open revolutionaries. Now, I want to see if we can just put this in a different light. The Boston radicals were convinced that all these different measures were evidence of a deeper conspiracy to reduce the colonists to servitude and slavery. Jefferson in 1774 stated unambiguously that, quote, though a single act of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of the day, a series of oppressions begun a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers to plainly prove a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. On and on came these claims. Washington agreed that the trouble had come from a, quote, regular systematic plan of oppression, the English government endeavoring by every piece of art and despotism to fix the shackles of slavery on us, right? Over and over came claims that in light of, I mean, I look at it, I try to divorce myself from the, my own socialization in US public schools, California public schools in the 1960s. And I look on this and I think, look, there's a disconnect here between British action and colonial reaction. The colonial reaction seems bizarre. It seems out of kilter. It doesn't make sense, particularly actually for so many cries of you're forcing slavery on us, voiced by people who themselves were holding other human beings in bondage, right? I'll just posit that the colonial response seems rooted in wild conspiracy, almost paranoia. In retrospect, it doesn't seem accurate to me that the whole thing was part of a systematic master plan to reduce the colonies to slavery. I tell my 18-year-old, 19-year-old students that if you believe that, can we reflect for at least 3 minutes on the existence of the nation of Canada? All right. Now, given what little we know about our northern neighbor, and for many of us that's not much, it doesn't appear to us, they had no wild, violent revolution, but it does not appear to us that they are currently grinding under the heel of British tyranny. All right. I think maybe these revolutionaries are blowing the whole thing out of proportion. Were they, I asked my students, was this rational? I mean, they want to pay our judges. It's part of a master plan to reduce us to slavery. It's bizarre. So the only way I say we can, well, we know what happened. On the basis of these bizarre, seemingly irrational claims, the colonists made war on the world's largest military power, knowing that if their revolution failed, it could land them all in the Tower of London. That's what England did to its dissenters. Benjamin Franklin at one point said, well, we all have to hang together, or we'll all hang separately, he said. So why do they do this? Why do they make this revolution? Which means we have to put ourselves in their heads and understand something called the ideology of revolutionary republicanism, right? And here I'm drawing from a whole series of historians of the 1960s, 1970s who laid this out. I'm a 20th century US historian, so I'm not a generator of any of this stuff. I'm just a consumer of this historical consensus. But people like Bernard Balin and Drew McCoy and Joyce Appleby, a whole series of excellent historians have laid out kind of their mind and put themselves in their head. Let me walk you through that. How's my pace so far? Am I going too fast? We're good? And you can hear me? All right. So first of all, let's get some common background understandings. James Trenchard and Robert Gordon were Whig activists in England in the 1730s, published a book called Cato's Letters, drawing from what was called the Country Party or the real Whig tradition that came out of the Glorious Revolution in England in the 1680s, right? Let's go back to the 1680s, the Glorious Revolution. And this is the quote unquote real Whig political tradition. They wrote books called Cato's Letters, which according to Balin, the founders all treasured like holy writ and passed down bound volumes to their sons and daughters and said, read Cato's Letters. And that's one of the sources from which they were borrowing. There's a whole host of them. And part of their worldview went like this. There's a whole series of background understandings. And let's first talk about social contract theory. It's a staple in our Western development of political philosophy. We know the social contract theory theorists, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, right? And the body of teaching goes like this, that in the beginning, right, we all begin in a state of nature, all right? We all live in a state of nature where, in Hobbes' words, life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? We're all preying on each other, and we all have a monopoly, right, to commit violence on our own behalves, right? Millie has a water bottle over there, and I'm bigger and stronger than Millie. I'll just go take your water bottle because I'm bigger and stronger. And Willie has the right to defend her water bottle, right, from me, right? But this is the law of the jungle, right? And she's got a right to use violence on her behalf. And finally, we all get together and say, well, this stinks. We can't survive like this. The strong preying on the weak. So we form a social contract, right? And we all get together and form, Hobbes called it the Leviathan. That's the name of his book, right? Locke called it the state. We form a state, right? We're all get together and form a state. And we give up our own monopoly of violence to this larger entity, the state, right? So the state is empowered to use violence on our behalf to protect us from each other. Locke, though, went further than Hobbes. John Locke, 17th century British theorist. He said that this is all fine, but when the government itself became a predator, when the government itself became rapacious, when the government itself used its power to impinge on our property, because Locke said all of us have an inherent right to life, liberty, and property, said Locke, we have the right to dissolve that contract. Let that contract go. Well, Jefferson, of course, was almost cribbing directly from Locke. I mean, here's the Declaration of Independence, right? Of course, we all know these words, right? And this is social contract theory 101. We hold these truths that men are created endowed by the greater to alienate unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, that was Jefferson's twist of that phrase, not life, liberty, and property, life, liberty, and happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among human beings, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. We all give up our monopoly on violence to form the social contract, right? But we only have to obey that social contract, obey that government insofar it does what we've contracted with it to do. But once it violates that contract, right? Whenever a form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to abolish or alter it and institute a new government. And then what follows, of course, is about 2 pages of Jefferson's brief against the king, right? Which is why we have this. So here's the Declaration of Independence. There's social contract theory 101, all right? Fundamental to their understandings of this founder so is that we need a power, right? We're going to form a power. We need a power. These aren't anarchists. But the more power you had, the less liberty you had. The founders 250 years ago were driven by a deep fear for the prospects for democracy. It was fragile, it was delicate, it was in need of constant oversight and protection. And any manifestation of power, whether it was political power, military power, or economic power, fundamentally endangered democracy. It was a threat to democracy. They used physical metaphors. Power had a voracious appetite for liberty. It devoured liberty, they said. They weren't anarchists. We need power, right? But we have to guard that power very jealously, very carefully, because it's going to devour, it will destroy our liberty. Power had to be limited and had to be circumscribed carefully. And they drew on popular histories of Sparta, Rome, Greece, Denmark. Democracies, they said, don't live long. They're very fragile. They're constantly being destroyed. They have a very short shelf life, all right? So, but nonetheless, they were going to go and create governments, and it needed to reflect the different powers in a society. If you follow this line of political thinking, of course, how do you construct government? You need to construct one with equal parts of the three different interests of society. You needed a king or a governor, right? You needed an aristocracy, right? A branch of government to reflect the aristocracy, and you needed a branch of government to reflect the people, a lower house, some giving the people some power. The traditional thinking said that all these different three bodies had to balance each other, and if any of those grew bigger than the others, then tyranny would result. So the other two had to check the power of the one. But if there was one branch where you need to put the predominant amount of power in this democracy, in this new social contract, it's with the people, it's with ordinary people, right? Because the real Whigs, of course, were most afraid of the king. And finally, there's one more point, and this is where it gets kind of fun. If we can move it up just a little bit, Willie. The 18th century political thinkers, and this was a staple of Western political thought. I mean, you think about Marx, also drew from a stage theory of history. History, they said, moved through certain stages, and it became so widely accepted, it's even expressed in popular art. And if you click, Millie, on that link where it says Cole, all right? Wait, just try to do a control click on that. Well, we'll get Sandow Burke. That's a modern expression. Yeah. All right. This is Thomas Cole's painting, 1834, right? The Course of Empire paintings. And this is how all societies, they said, develop, right? We start off in a state of nature, all right? Whereas Hobbes said life is nasty, brutish, and short. And over time, we reach the next. We start off in the savage state. Is this big enough for you to see in the back row? If I turn the lights down, is it better? It's better? All right. If you move it up a little bit, Millie, just to get this next one is the pastoral state or Arcadian state. This is Thomas Cole, 1834, but it's so internet into popular culture, right? That Cole can do this in 1830s. Everyone knows what he's talking about. All societies proceed through these different stages, right? Farming people close to the soil. And here's some Greco-Roman temple and somebody sitting there contemplatively. Here's Aristotelian scholar farmers, looking contemplatively at the land, and Greeks, women walking through the barefoot in the daisies, and children playing. I don't know what they're doing. And keep your eye on this mountain here. And keep always in this mountain, these next stages, right? So as society proceeds, they sooner or later get to this third stage, all right? Which is, if you push it ahead, Millie, just keep scrolling up, right? The consummation of empire. There's our mountain over to the right. Here it is, the consummation of empire. Greco-Romans sitting around having people peel grapes for them and putting them in their mouths, and great art and literature being performed, and marble temples, and massive wealth, massive luxury and finery. But we all know where this is going. Democracies are doomed in the end. They all die. Push it up, Millie, one more. Because following the consummation of empire is apocalypse. And finally, if you push it up, Millie, one more. It's collapse. It's collapse. Desolation. All societies are going to go through these stages. Okay, now let's put all this together, right? Of all these stages, which one do you suppose in their mind was most conducive to democracy? By the way, I want to just let a few more background understandings. Here's where I need I'm going to use my little bit of board. Jefferson and others, Franklin, were reading the early musings of one of our great demographers, a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus, right? Thomas Malthus, a British clergy person, right? Clergyman, right? Cleric, all right? And Malthus had begun to postulate some alarming new ideas about demography. Malthus said, over time, food supply is going to go like this. Food supply goes like that, and population goes like this. Right? And once population exceeds food supply, what happens? That's what happens. It's apocalypse. Right? The mobs attack the rich. Right? Which of these stages, according to Jefferson and the Revolutionary Republicans, was most conducive to democracy? Jefferson was also the follower of a French school of philosophers called the physiocrats. right? So was Franklin. Which is most conducive to democracy? That second stage, absolutely. Pastoral agrarian societies. That was right. That's the stage most conducive to democracy. All this stuff, the luxury consumption, the inequalities of wealth, those were all signs of an advanced, dying, decaying civilization. Massive wealth inequality is something we should always worry about, right? It's going to corrupt your politics. It will lead inexorably to tyranny, which is followed, of course, by apocalypse and then the collapse of civilization. If you go back, William, and click on Sandow Burke, just for the fun of it, leave that one. Leave that one. Click on this next one, Rise and Fall of LA. This was done by a 20th century painter, Sandow Burke, just to give you a sense of, all right, Rise and Fall of Los Angeles. Click on the Savage State, if you would, Billy. See if you can make that bigger. If you click on that one, yeah, there's a Savage State. No, now went to one. Yeah, go back. Click on the Savage State. Right here we are. La Brea tar pits, dinosaurs, Coke can. All right, and just click on the next one, Millie, if you would. Just walk us through the Savage State to the pastoral state. Here we are. Right, there's someone being lynched over here, so it's not all sweetness in the garden, right? And here's the La Brea tar pits, and there's a kid looking at, and here is the consummation of empire, right? And you can see the Hollywood Hills there. Right? If I remember, we have the Hollywood Hills, and then we get apocalypse, right? And then all right, kind of eerie, I think. All right, so look, if this is the mindset you're in, it's clear where the colonists thought we were. We were in that third stage, that second stage, right? Now there were already portents of disaster. They were noticing increased economic inequalities in their own day. The liveried carriages going through the streets of New York and Rhode Island, increased economic inequality in their own day. That was nothing compared to England, right? England was clearly at this consummation of empire. The great aristocracies were at high life, and they were oppressing the poor. We saw the emergence of these foul Dickensian slums that Dickens 80 years later would write about in London that went on and on and on. England's in that third stage. We're in that second stage. And the thing that alarmed the colonists more than anything else is where the laws were coming from, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. They didn't expect much from the king. The king, in Thomas Paine's word, was a royal brute, right? They always expect bad things of executives. They're always going to oppress people. They're always going to destroy freedom, right? King was a royal brute. But what alarmed the colonists was that, in fact, they were coming from Parliament, right? So the great bastion of British liberties. So the fear is that, of course, Parliament's been affected. The only thing left for us to do is cut that tie. That virus is afoot. It's already happening here in the United States, right? And so there's the push for revolution. And there's the push to dissolve that social contract and to rewrite it. Now, I'm going to rush ahead because I'm cognizant of the times. Clearly, liberty is in danger. And secondly, there was a concern for moral regeneration at the heart of this ideology. England was on its way into depravity and decay. Liberty was dying there. America was the only hope of the world. You have it in your power, said Thomas Paine, to begin the world over again. And you must root this in a nation of small farmers, right? And we have to worry about corruption in our own ranks, because already we're seeing the growing evidence of commercial corruption. America was approaching this corruption of England, so we have to cut off that tie and return to civic virtue, Spartan living, and godly purpose, all right? And so they did. They dissolved that tie. They made a revolution, greatly aided by the French, and they began the processes of forming new state governments. Massachusetts led the way in laying down some fundamental principles of American constitutionalism, that power resides in the people, that governmental power is located in a written constitution that expresses a popular will, and that government has to operate within those constitutional limits. What the new charter, if the new charter doesn't say the government can do, it can't do it. Freedom was a default. This is what the government can do. It's a written body of laws. It's a charter. It's a contract. And if the government doesn't, if that contract doesn't say it can do it, it can't do it. Now, one more point, because I'm cognizant of the time. Do we have time to go to Washington's farewell address. It's what time's breakfast? You know, I not do it. And I was going to bring in Jefferson here. Jefferson, oh look, go to if you would. Yeah, you know what? No, let's do this. I don't know, we're good. Here's Jefferson, right? Love these lines. The political economist of Europe says, established as a principle, he says that every state should endeavor to manufacture itself. The new push in Europe is to manufacturing. All right. But everyone says we should transfer those principles to America without calculating the differences of circumstances we have here. In Europe, the lands are either cultivated or locked up against a cultivator. You've got to go to manufacturing as a necessity, not by choice, to support the surplus of the people. But we have an immensity of land according to the industry of the husbandman. And a husbandman would have been a farmer, right? The patrons of husbandry, all right? Can you read this in the back row? Right? It's not too, all right. And so what is Jefferson calling for? We've got to be a nation, he says, of small farmers, right? Anyone grew up on a farm here? All right, Ellie, I think actually if I look just right, it's got a little halo over your head. And there it is, all right? So, yeah, there you are. Why? Because only farmers, right? Those are the chosen people of God as ever he's had a chosen people, says Jefferson, right? Farmers, all right? We've never seen corruption in the mass of cultivators. No nation has ever furnished an example of that because they're not looking to heaven, they're looking at their own soil industry, as does the husbandman for their subsistence. All right, and one more point. What does he say here? Well, we have the land to labor in. Let's never to see our citizens working at a workbench, right, or twirling a distaff, which is kind of manufacturing enterprises. Now, he has a place in his vision for small-scale artisans. Carpenters, masons, and smiths are wanting in husbandry for the general operations manufacturer. Let our workshops remain. All right, there's Jefferson's vision. Of course, the major, most signal accomplishment of his administration was to get land for what he thought would be 100 generations of small farmers. All right, it turns out he was wrong. It lasted for about 3. But the greatest thing he did, and this is consistent with his vision, was to, of course, get land called the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, right, in St. Louis and Clark, to see what kind of land grab we got. Didn't consult with the people who were living there, all right, but that was his way of forestalling the inevitable collapse of democracy. Because once we turn to manufacturing, economic inequalities will result, and the whole thing will die, and we'll go through that stage theory. One more point. The founders were deeply concerned about the problem of self-interest. And by self-interest, they were worried about factions, all right? And the word, another word for factions, well, they called factions, we call political parties. Sometimes I've had students turn to the Constitution, which is in the back of their text, and let's just list all the mentions of political parties in this Constitution. Let's look at nominating conventions and the on the primary system, and we look and discover, of course, there's not a word mentioned. It's not there. All right. The founders would have thought that any political party would have been faction, and faction represented self-interest, and self-interest is not conducive to democracy. Self-interest leads us into that 4th stage. Okay. And if I had time, we could have called up Washington's farewell address, which is it's dense, but he's screaming. Much of it is screaming about factions and parties, and we can't have factions. We can't have parties there. They're going to let loose a canker that's going to eat away at our democracy. This is 1799, his parting words, right? Even as Washington was clearly acting as the head of what we identify as a political party, right? The old Federalists, right? I mean, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a Federalist, right? And we had the emergence of the first party system in his administration, but they were vociferously afraid of parties. All right. I'm going to push this ahead because I got, how much, 15 minutes, Libby? We understand that the founders had a revolution. They freed themselves, for reasons I've just talked about, from the maws of Great Britain, and they had to decide what we're going to do. And for the first 8 years of this republic, we operated under something called the Articles of Confederation, which created a barely viable national government for the colonies, though it was a very weak one. It would barely function as a national government. It gave the Congress some basic rights of national governing authority. It could regulate foreign affairs, declare war, deal with Native Americans, run the post office, and mediate boundary disputes between states. And that was all it could do. All the states jealously guarded all the other functions of a normal national authority. Congress can't raise troops. It could levy taxes only with difficulty. All it could do was pass resolutions asking for states for support on various issues. It has no power to compel anything. And that's the structure that led us through revolution. Washington begged and pleaded with individual states, individual colonies then, for money, for troops, right? It was phenomenal that he pulled this off, that these struggling 13 squabbling little independent countries actually came together and won their independence from Great Britain. States' disputes were so intense that the Articles of Confederation weren't even ratified until 1783 after the war was over, all right? They stated the supremacy of states' rights. And through the 1780s, there was this government faced crisis after crisis after crisis that it could not adequately respond to. There were officers' complaints about bonuses and pensions. The Army marched on the government in Philadelphia. The government had to flee and move to New York to escape the Army. Sometimes we Americans, I think, are a little too snooty about the struggles of other early emerging democracies in the world. We forget our own origins, right, in which we actually had mutinies and fleeing the Army. And Native American warfare broke out across the frontier right after the war, and Congress was paralyzed by inaction. It was incapable of dealing with foreign relations. There's immense trouble with Spain, who closed their port at the mouth of the Mississippi, the port of New Orleans, stagnated the entire trade, internal trade of the country. Ports were closed to American shipping. States refused to let Congress regulate foreign commerce. They tried to cut deals with European powers on their own. I don't have time to do anything else, but in fact, wave at a rebellion in Western Massachusetts called Shays Rebellion, all right? But Shays Rebellion broke out in Western Massachusetts. Governor Sam Adams sent in troops to crush that rebellion in Western Massachusetts by farmers who were being evicted. And finally, in 1786, enough people were aware of these crises that they said, we can't do this anymore. We've got to rethink our social contract. They pulled together a delegate at a small convention in 1786, got together to deal with the problems of interstate commerce, and pushed for a larger convention to deal with many of the problems of the Articles, to revise the Articles. It was clear when the delegates arrived in Philadelphia in December of 1787, they were going to do more than simply revise the Articles. What they did was produce a contract for a much stronger national government, which we call the United States Constitution, right? And I am only going to walk you through some basic compromises which went into that body. It was profoundly contentious. It was a hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. People got fed up and left. Once it was clear that we were going towards a stronger national state, so the most arch opponents of a national state just left in disgust. They weren't going to have any more to do with it. And they had these fundamental disputes, and any of us who've been through high school know the disputes, right? There's a dispute between big states versus smaller states. Big states wanted representation in the legislature based on population, which of course gives them an advantage. Smaller states wanted it based on the state, all right, which would maximize their power. Representation based on population would further empower the South, especially because southern states were delegates from southern states were trying to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to be able to count the people they enslaved for reasons of congressional power allocation, but not count them, of course, as real human beings, because that would undermine the entire system of slavery. And we know the great compromises, right? So we had an upper house based on the state and lower house based on population. States were given the same vote regardless of size in the upper house, which they called the eye of the Greco-Roman heritage, the Senate, right? And Massachusetts, by the way, had done this. They were actually simply borrowing from the states, and power allocated on the basis of population in the House, all right? With enslaved people counting as 3/5 of a vote for reasons of taxation and congressional power allocation. They prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River. as far west as they could imagine the republic going, which is to say the Mississippi, and setting up a country half slave and half free. And they also, by the way, did their best to limit the people's power. There's lots of worry about the people having too much power, right? I mean, all you got to do is look at the crises that we had in the 1780s. Crisis after crisis after crisis, said the founders. And so we have to dilute the power of ordinary people. And one of the great dilutions of ordinary people's power was, of course, the Electoral College, which you're going to hear about, I think, next month, right? The Electoral College. And the other was, of course, you're not going to give ordinary people the right to elect senators. We didn't get direct election of United States senators until, I think, 1908, right? Somewhere in this book is that, right? State legislatures elected senators, which assured that it would be, you know, represent the aristocracy, the well-born, the well-heeled. And that has set up, of course, a fundamental bias inherent in the United States national government on behalf of rural areas and small states. All right. Ezra Klein says this well. America, he says, is a democracy. Our political system is built around geographical units, all of which privilege sparse rural areas over dense urban ones. Okay. Sets on some fundamental inequalities in the way we do our politics. I have 8 more minutes. Should I keep going? Or you want to throw questions at me? Should I keep going? That was the document. It was heavily debated. A majority of Americans are probably against it. The only way the Constitution got ratified was through some shifty, shaky politicking. Part of the Federalists, people advocating for this Constitution, had a number of advantages. They were, most of the leaders of the revolution were Federalists. They had extraordinary prestige. They also had control in many cases over state party apparatuses, state governments. And so states where there was clear a Federalist majority, they pushed for an early vote, right, to create a sense of momentum. The deal was of the 13 original states, you had to get it ratified by 9 of them in order to take precedent, in order to be empowered. States where they were ahead, they pushed for an early vote. States where they were behind, they delayed the vote. Sometimes they spread deliberate lies. Virginia was heavily dominated by anti-Federalists. So right on the eve of Virginia's vote, the Federalists spread a rumor there that Patrick Henry, right, had endorsed the Constitution, which he of course had not. By the time Henry could issue a retraction, the vote had happened and Virginia had ratified the Constitution. They made some compromises, right? The first 10 amendments, the United States Bill of Rights, they said, you know, was the only way they're going to get states like Massachusetts or New York on board. I want to close by turning to 2 documents, 2 of the arguments that the Federalists made, because they speak so much to some of the issues we're struggling with today. This is, I have here my copy of the Federalist Papers, right? Some might take it to sleep. It's a great read to have around the house. And, or be forced to read it by your college professor, but those days are long past for you. So you can see Madison here in Federalist number 49, worrying about the passions of the people, right? More worried about the passions of the people, right? What we need, he says, is a stronger government to regulate those passions, all right? They ought to be controlled and regulated by the government, right? Mere declarations of the Constitution are not sufficient to restrain the people, right? We need a strong state to regulate people's passions. Again, there's a lot of worry about too much democracy. Finally, I want to look at Federalist number, right? Federalist number 10. Fascinating what Madison's doing. I'm going to try to take this. Move this. All right, there we go. All right, oops. Move these over here. Right. See if you can do it more. Madison's worrying about the dangers of faction here, right? The dangers of faction. All right. curing the mischiefs of faction. And here we go. Here's Madison and Federalist number 10. And this is how he begins. The advantages constructing these, the Federalist Papers were arguments on behalf of this new document that they were newspaper columns published anonymously, though people kind of figure out who they were, Jay and Madison and Alexander Hamilton. The majority of them were written by Madison, a firm Federalist at the time. So here's Madison addressing the dangers of faction, all right? And everywhere we hear that governments are too unstable, the public good is disregarded, right? And everyone knows they're true. We have factional disputes. No matter what we do, there are people acting on behalf of self-interest. So what do we do with the question of self-interest in politics? All right, and so he's going to define faction here. All right, can you read this in the back row? Majority of citizens actuated by some common impulse of passion of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, right? So we have a group of people saying, no, we want this. We're motivated by our own self-interest, all right? And so then Madison says, well, we have to deal with this. Let's address this. How do we cure the mischiefs of faction? One, we could remove its causes, the other by controlling its effects. Okay, we either got to remove the causes of faction or controlling the damage it does to democracy. All right? Well, he says let's address the first. One, you could destroy the liberty that's essential to existence. Or secondly, you give to every citizen the same passions, the same opinions, the same interests. And then he discounts both those options, right? The first option is that and this is so critical. It can never more be said of the first remedy that it's worse than disease. Liberty is to fashion what air is to fire. An element without it, which it instantly expires. Liberty is to fashion what air is to fire. Madison is saying what? If we're going to be a free people, if we're going to have liberty, we're going to have different opinions. Let's just be honest, right? There is no larger common good that unites us all. There's just our individual goods. If we're gonna be free people, right? What are we gonna do? Get rid of liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, right? And secondly, the second expedient is impractical as it first would be unwise, right? Different opinions are gonna be formed. We are gonna have factions. If we let people be free, we're going to have faction, we're going to have self-interest, right? People will always act selfishly. They'll form factions to protect their own self-interests, right? And so what does he say? We need the common good is just the accumulation of all of our struggles for our individual goods, right? He turns those common kind of classic arguments of revolutionary republicanism on their head. Let's be honest, we're self-centered individuals. If you allow us to be free, we're going to have factions, right? People are going to pursue their own goods. And so what we need is a stronger national state to serve as a mediating, controlling influence. And when everyone pursues their own good, a larger public good will be maintained, says Madison, right? And this raises some larger questions about whether Madison was right. Is the common good in America best maintained by everyone just pursuing their own individual self-interests? Or is there a wider good that's bigger than all of our interests in which we need to take pains to safeguard? And we are still having that debate 250 years later, and we still haven't found a satisfactory answer. Well, I'm going to bring this to a close with a bit of a speech. The founders came together to create a whole new social contract that would serve as the basis of their ongoing life together. They called it the United States Constitution. And it was a remarkable, amazing accomplishment. It was rooted in some basic principles of United States constitutionalism that were new on the global stage and have safeguarded liberties ever since. That power resides in the people. That the power of the state is located in a written document, the Constitution, that expresses the popular will. And then government could only operate within the limits set up by that charter, that fundamental social contract. If the document did not give the power, the new state power to do something, then the government could not do it. Liberty was not some extra chrome add-on. Liberty was essential. Freedom was the default. It's a remarkable document. All right. And it's set in stone for a whole new state that was not set in place without incredible controversy, complexity, and compromise. All right. And two of the compromises we've seen here. In order to gain the support of white Southerners, the Constitution allowed them to count as people they held in bondage as 3/5 of a person. It tacitly recognized slavery. It enshrined racial inequality. And secondly, the major creators of the Constitution, historians have documented, were by and large wealthy, aristocratic men. They began to fear that the power of the people had gone too far. They set up some real checks on the popular will. All right. They limited the power of the people. They worried about the passions of the people overtly affecting government. In other words, the founders created an amazing charter for new government that's preserved democracy for over 250 years and for which they deserved everlasting gratitude. But in enshrining inequality and checking the popular will, they created a charter that was flawed. It was flawed. Of course it was flawed. And to point out these flaws is not a sign of disrespect. It's a sign, presumably, of patriotism. And ever since that new charter began functioning, some of our greatest leaders have recognized those flaws and worked to correct them. And here's these quotes I gave some of you by Lincoln, all right? Lincoln wrote, "As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon," he warned, quote, "it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy," unquote. Or take the words of Franklin Roosevelt, who in 1935 pledged to his Secretary of Labor, a former social worker named Francis Perkins, that, quote, "We are going to make a country in which no one gets left out," unquote. And for the entire history of this country, since its founding, those words have been led not just by presidents or elites in Washington, but by ordinary Americans, artisans and farmers and labor unions and working people and women and people of color, especially women and people of color. In fact, the two parallel struggles, liberation struggles of women and people of color, have been intertwined and have served for decade after decade as a great source of democratic possibility and renewal. And they've left us with a legacy that the League of Women Voters, among other groups, has determined to protect. That democracy, you all know, was a healthy, delicate, precious thing. It needed constant protection. They're unsure about whether the nation could preserve it, right? And that's still arguably very much an open question. I understand that one of the basic purposes of the League of Women Voters is to protect and enrich the democracy that we have inherited. And so all I can say is thank you for this work, and I've enjoyed exploring that with you this week. There's my closing speech.